Good morning, colleagues. Welcome everybody at a session dedicated to the burning issue of new imperial history, post-colonial history. It's a very, very interesting topic for everybody of us. We have three speakers, three panelists, and the order is indicated in the program, beginning with Jan SURMAN from Masaryk Institute. May I note that every panelist has 15 to 20 minutes available for his presentation, yes, because there's no any woman. Okay, please, Jan.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you to all the scholars who canceled so that you invite me. Because I think in comparison to few scholars, I mean several colleagues who yesterday talked about their ongoing project, for me the post-colonial project or the new imperial history is nothing I work on. I did it 2012 and then abandoned the field and don't want to come back. And I will be explaining why I don't want to come back. I'm like part of the interest, my interest in the field is connected with me being historian of science and just liking to investigate things that are happening also in current academia. So basically today's talk will be a little bit kind of connected with this. The title is a working title, which I came up with while on the train to Budapest, when I realized that I never asked what I should be speaking about, whether it should be kind of, and the email said then my field. And then I started reflecting what my field is. And I'm actually from history of science. I do currently actually socialist transnational history, which doesn't include that much postcolonial studies. But I did university history and I did Habsburg studies. So there's also like how I come out of it. But while on the train, I like started reflecting a little bit about, what I can say and how, I can connect the fields and connect the dots and do something which is meaningful. And I think that, while on the train from Prague to Budapest, to Bratislava, there's actually a very good space to think about post-colonial, about the questions of empire. And one of the things that came up to my mind is like few days ago, I saw an advertisement for České dráhy, which is the railroad carrier, in which a Moravian, like very rich peasant, I think, because he has the kind of, the kind of expensive clothes, comes into a compartment and then kind of has a discussion with a Prague intellectual, and the Moravian peasant has a kind of jar of pickled cucumbers. Evidently not very educated and kind of, and when I saw this advertisement a few days ago, I thought like, well, you probably wouldn't make jokes like this about women. Even in Czechia, they wouldn't. But kind of portraying peasants in a kind of slightly derogatory way, it still sounds as a thing which doesn't pose any problems. I will come back to it later, but I mean, it is very important for the way I understand postcolonial, and I think how postcolonial can contribute to the current discussions. So, bear in mind the picture of a rich Moravian peasant. And one of the thoughts I had is like, if there is like kind of this kind of portrayals of Moravians, which is actually quite widespread in Czechia, then how did it look like with Slovaks before? There is not that a big discussion about Slovak post-colonial, but there is one, and my Czech colleagues are very angry about it. They're also very angry about Moravia post-colonial. And then when I was thinking about it, what I can contribute also is, I came up with a lot of jokes and a few slides. I think that the joke which was kind of can lead, apart from the story with the Moravian peasant, is happening in Moscow, and try to imagine Moscow 2010-ish. Which is kind of this kind of idea that Moscow will be liberal. We have a conference at Higher School of Economics, and then after it, we are working with Maciej Janowski. I mean, some of you know him, and he was mentioned yesterday, so he was kind of intellectual historian he was at CEU, now he's in Poland. And we were walking and kind of playing with a cigarette, and the cigarette falls down. I'm picking it up. He's shocked completely that I'm picking up random cigarettes from the street in Moscow. And then we start kind of talking. And then I say like, well, I do post-colonial now. And he gets, even more scared than from me picking up random cigarettes and asks me, are you one of them? And I will come to one of them in a second. It's not that he rejects all the post-colonial. There's a special way of doing post-colonial studies that he rejected at the time, and in the meantime, I do also. And the last thing about, before coming to really post-colonial is this one, which is a photo, or almost the photo which I was sent when I was speaking to a Hungarian colleague, when I was telling her that I do post-colonial studies. And she immediately wrote me like, this is what the Hungarian government actually say. We were always a colony of, Habsburg Empire, whatever, now European Union. So that the wording of colony kind of trickles down in the politics. It does now also in Poland. At the time when I was there, it didn't to me, evidently, but it does now. So there's a lot of associations which people have when talking about post-colonial, which makes it a little bit complicated while talking about post-colonial studies. Also, while talking about post-colonial studies and trying to make it into a unitary field, because I don't think it is, there is so many different branches of post-colonial studies that they also kind of are in conflict. So I don't want to enumerate them. I think that also every idea how to describe them would kind of fail because the variety is too big. But coming a little bit back to making Maciej Janowski scared, what he had in mind is especially a particular tradition which began with Eva Thompson and her books about imperial knowledge, which is basically a description of how Russia was always a colonizer. This is 2000, I think, 2. It is a little bit similar to what Alexander Etking was later doing with the question of internal colonization. And Eva Thompson, she's a scholar at Rice University and editor of Sarmatian Review. I think that I don't have to explain what Sarmatians are. There is like a kind of very political meaning also to it. And she started using post-colonial theory to analyze Polish literature. And several scholars started following her, partially giving interesting results, partially not that interesting results, I would say. But this is kind of a strain that started developing in Poland. So it's an import of a Polish scholar who then, I think, 68 emigrates to the United States, then adopts postcolonial theory to write about Polish literature, about Central European literatures, and then this theory gets adapted again in Poland. Apparently, it didn't really kind of bear fruit in any other context, just Poland. The problem is that both Thompson and several scholars of this group, I will not call names apart from her name, are near to the right-wing government. Basically, what they are portraying in their use of the postcolonial theory is that Poland was always a victim of being between Germany and Russia. Germany and Russia were always trying to colonize Poland. That European Union is now colonizing Poland, and they use postcolonial theory to do it, which is kind of very interesting, and it's very interesting to actually read how they appropriate postcolonial theory to do it. They really quote classics of postcolonial theory and subaltern studies, and the quotation in a way makes sense, in a way as kind of very artistic way of using postcolonial theory. But it kind of works. And some of them were kind of ideological supporters of the government, of the right-wing government. And the government actually at some moment also started using parts of the theory, of the vocabulary, of postcolonial vocabulary. Now, there's of course Christianity, which plays an immense role, and there is as good as zero reflection about what Russia is. Russianness is, Poland is, Polishdom is, Christianity is, whatever. So it's in a way actually kind of writing further the story of Poles being eternal victims of the universe, just with a new vocabulary. And they also very openly say that they are writing back, using again the postcolonial idea of writing back. And the colonial and postcolonial vocabulary is a tool for them to become part of the global world history. This is also the reason why, while I was using postcolonial theory until 2012, when I wrote a few smaller pieces about it, I abandoned it because for me, it's Central European context kind of is a little bit a minefield. You don't really know in which context people think you are. And then you will find yourself in a kind of right-wing conference, which I would be really very lost. And there is a kind of special expectation what you do, and stereotypes what you do. So this is why I kind of stopped being part of the field. I've never been a part of the field, but at least we did one of the books, and I will come a little bit more to it in a second. The book the volume came out 2012, and is in a way a continuation of Habsburg postcolonial project. Yesterday you were introduced to Moritz Czaki, so I don't have to introduce him further. He's an Austrian scholar based now in Vienna, who has a tremendously productive group, which, among others, deals with postcolonial studies, with memory studies. So it's an Institute for Cultural Studies and History of Theater at the Austrian Academy of Sciences. And like 2 decades ago, they did a book called Habsburg Postcolonial, in which they were trying to use postcolonial theory and postcolonial approach, actually, rather than theory, to analyze the Habsburg Empire and Habsburg successor states. And then the group actually, over the years, was using postcolonial theory to various cases. Among others, Johannes Feichtinger was working on a crossroad between postcolonial theory and history of science, and this is how I got involved into it. So here you have several of the publications which came out of the group. It is also the most recent development is how to write about Habsburg history of knowledge in a global way with the use of postcolonial theory. So this is, by this I basically mean what now would be called actually intersectional theory. So there are different various modes of dominance and effects of dominance, which do not limit themselves to being cultural. So this is one of the kind of main critic points towards postcolonial theory, that it essentializes culture. But Habsburg postcolonial was trying to exactly escape the way of essentializing culture by looking at exactly what is now called intersectionalism. So this is also another reason why I don't think that postcolonial studies is that necessary as a field in it, because it was kind of overtaken by other fields, which I think were kind of at the beginning very close to postcolonial theory and developed in a way which is actually a little bit more interesting. And I will, at the very end, I will give you 2 examples. And exactly as a continuation of Habsburg postcolonial, we did Galicia postcolonial, which was discussing Galicia, so Habsburg Galicia, the province which is the Eastern Habsburg Empire, not easternmost Habsburg Empire, but Eastern Habsburg Empire, with various interests, ethnicities. In the most basic terms, it would be Poles versus Ukrainians. But if you use the modern terminology, there is a lot of more identifications which happen there. and you have different conflicts, and you have different inclusions processes, exclusion processes. You have national difference, you have opposition to nationalism, and so on and so on. So we played all of it in this volume, including also gender studies, including the question of peasants, of different social categories. Which you have. So if you want, I heartily invite you. The volume, the issue is in open access, and this is basically what we thought the post-colonial could do. It's kind of look at the variety of exclusion processes which are happening within a single province. We didn't really connect it to global colonialism, although evidently there are some stereotypes of global colonialism. Othering stereotypes which are coming and get reinterpreted for Galicia. There are some stereotypes of Galicia which are then kind of exported. So it is clearly a part of the global colonization global process of colonial dominance. But it's also one of the arguments is that there is a difference between post-colonial with a dash, like post-colonial and post-colonial. And we claim that while we can use post-colonial approach to analyze Galicia, we cannot really say that Galicia is post-colonial because it was never colonial. Whatever you will use, soft colonialism was the term which was en vogue at the time. You can reinterpret it in so many ways, but it still doesn't really make sense. That the kind of doesn't do justice to what colonialism is as a process, as a historical process. So while our argument is that while we can use postcolonial theory or postcolonial approach, it has its limitations. But what we did, and here there is a kind of very interesting point, and I think very important point, is that we also were trying to use the theories and approaches which were there in Galician literature, not only Polish literature, although the examples here are only Polish, but also in Ukrainian literature, which also at the time was discussing post-colonial very strongly, with Mykola Repczuk, for example, or Sergei Yechilchuk. So there were authors also kind of having a very, very local understanding of post-colonialism. And we were trying to compare it and discuss it together with non-European colonialisms, but also with the questions of Irish colonialism. So the introductions is kind of a discussion between several of the post-colonial research strains. And I exactly think that while this strain, this research field that I described at the very beginning, that comes from Thompson, which kind of tries one-to-one to translate the overseas colonialism into Galicia. I think that it's much more productive to try to look at how local scholars were dealing with the question of how they describe variety and the cultural exclusion processes. So this was also one of our strong arguments, which I think it's very valid until now, that we cannot really we cannot really take one theory and take it from one context to another, but we really have to have a very intensive dialogues with localities and with research culture happening there. And interestingly, when I was telling that I'm always surprised that I have to speak about post-colonial, although I don't speak post-colonial, is that for several years, nobody invited me for post-colonial. And in the last 2 years, I started to be kind of, it's like fifth or sixth time I speak about post-colonial. So it kind of comes back, surprisingly. Which also says something about the field, and I'm also very interested. I mean, it's also that post-colonial 10 years ago was rather in literary studies. Historians are, I don't want to say that historians are always belated with adopting new approaches, but they're not always in the avant-garde. So now post-colonial is becoming part of the historical vocabulary when the colonial actually is the topic which is discussed globally. And I can only invite you on 16th, 17th November, we'll have in Munich a conference about what happens after the colonial. Because 5 minutes. I'm almost done. Because we are also unhappy with how The colonial discussion is bringing also national essentialism, cultural essentialism back. So we try to imagine what will be, the next step. But it's also not that everything what happens is bad or brings nationalism back. And this is also one of the answers to the question which was posed yesterday about intersectionality and gender. I had this slide actually before the question was there. In Poland, in recent years, there was sometimes it's called Ludic turn, sometimes it's called folk turn, which is an approach which is trying to discover the epistemology of the peasant populations and write the history of whatever from the perspective of villages and villagers. And interestingly, this approach takes up a lot from post-colonial studies and a lot of subaltern studies. And while not really going into the dialogue with, for example, Habsburg post-colonial or Galicia post-colonial, it actually picks up several of the topics which we tried to address 10 years ago. And I always think that, it's a kind of interesting byproduct of it. And so this is exactly where I think that post-colonial approaches and post-colonial vocabularies have more sense than writing the history of Polish victimhood, that we try to discover what is actually kind of within the kind of Polish myths in themselves and what kind of cultural variety is there in the region. So, when I'm for example, talking about the Moravian villager in a advertisement of Czeskie Drachy, it is also because we have to look at Czech national building as a process of national consolidation, which also kind of is a process of cultural violence towards other groups which actually don't have the voice anymore. And if you look at stereotypes which are there, you can quite easily see which groups were excluded from this kind of mainstream nation which then appears. And this is exactly where the folk turn in Poland is actually kind of takes up this discussion. And in the last, I would say 12 months, there were several discussions which were connecting the folk turn. So the folk turn itself is like 4 to 5 years, and now it's connected with gender studies. And as a historian of science, I always have the feeling that gender studies is the nearest field to history of science. And I think that also here we can see how the Volksturn and how the kind of post-colonial theory in connection with gender studies bears the most interesting fruit. And I think this is the direction that post-colonial studies in Central Europe can take. Thank you so much.
Thank you. The discussion will be later. The next speaker will be Krisztián CSAPLÁR-DEGOVICS from ONCE Academic Historical Institute. And he is a specialist in Albanian and Balkan history. And more recently, he has engaged in very serious studies and researches in terms of post-colonial developments in the context of Central and Southeastern Europe. Please.
Thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to express my gratitude to Gábor for this conference. It's a great occasion to meet you and to have this discussion in Hungary on new imperial history, global history, and so on. Yesterday I was a bit confused what to say today because many panelists touched upon the topics of new imperial history and colonial research. And the many projects, many plans, many theoretical approach we heard. So I wanted to something concrete, a concrete case study to show you. Today, this is the reason why I choose to say something about Bosnia and Herzegovina. The lecture of Jan is a good basis for me. He mentioned that he showed us these posters, Nem leszünk gyarmat. I think I can show you one of the roots of in my lecture, and I'm also grateful for this Russian colonialism of Erkind and Thomson, which were, so I didn't know Eva Thomson, but I used the book of Alexander Erkind for my research. And since the colonial research is also a kind of import in Hungary, hopefully I'm far from being an active supporter of the Hungarian government in this self-victimization project we see today. So let's get down to business. So this is my lecture is a concise summary on one chapter of my book. We have no colonies and no ambitions of conquest, Hungarian participation in the colonial affairs of the monarchy in the Balkans. This book was published in last year and will be published in German and Croatian languages in the next years, hopefully. So if you take a closer look at the colonial past of the European states at the turn of the century, do you know which empire's place remains blank on the map? This white patch on the continent is none other than Austria-Hungary. The lack of relevant research can partly be traced back to the fact that it did not fit into the former self-image of the Habsburg Empire to reflect on itself as a colonial power. And after its collapse in 1918, the national historiographies and political elites of the successor states of the Danube Empire even more vehemently denied the possibility of a colonial past than the previous imperial propaganda. Another reason, at least for me, for the lack of relevant research is that it is difficult to apply theories and perspectives related to colonialism to the former Danube monarchy. Jan mentioned some example of this. On the one hand, the current theories were basically formulated in investigating the colonial past of transatlantic and not East European countries. On the other hand, or East European empires. On the other hand, the terminology of international diplomacy and law was far from being as uniform prior to 1914 as it has been suggested by international historiography. The Habsburg Empire, for instance, had its own imperial terminology and its own concepts, among other things in connection with empire building and colonization. It is the idea of Maureen Healy to compile the colonial and imperial dictionary of Austria-Hungary. And maybe this examples could serve as a starting point for this ambition. If you see through these terms, if I may turn your attention to the Arbeitsgebiet, to the term Arbeitsgebiet. I'm not a native German speaker, but I suppose if somebody do not know reading the documents in the archives in Vienna in the Haus of Staatsarchiv, that this Arbeitsgebiet refers to is a synonym for colony or colonial Besitz, then maybe the context is not understandable for the researchers. And I think if we try to find the place of Austria-Hungary within the empires at the turn of the century, from the perspective of new imperial history, it's also important to see that how unique all the empires were at that time in their terms sometimes. So that is why until now there have not been written many publications that systematically scrutinized the colonial past of Austria-Hungary. However, there are some case studies in Galicia, or there is a debate in the Austrian historiography on the term internal colony. So there are some case studies mostly related to the history of the Austro-Hungarian Bosnia-Herzegovina, based on which some historians refer to the Danube monarchy as a colonial empire. Moreover, a comparative study of occupied Bosnia-Herzegovina and British India and British East Africa has begun by Robin Oakey, Robert Donya, Clemens Rutner, Benno Gammel, and Karl Adam. My investigation is based on my own empirical experience as a researcher and on some facts rooted around at the turn of the century. Firstly, while conducting my research in the Austrian National Archive, I often came across unpublished documents according to which the diplomats of the British Foreign Office and the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs regarded the Habsburg Empire as a colonial power. And I'm fully aware that the British and French diplomatic corps in the 19th century did know more about colonialism than the historians of the 20th century Central Europe, most of whom even today refuse to consider that the Danube monarchy may have had a colonial past. I know that this statement is a bit provocative, but this result was also confusing for me. Secondly, in the Institut Colonial International, founded in 1894 in Brussels, each country was assigned a number of seats that was in accordance with its supposed colonial importance. And one of the member states was Austria-Hungary, and Russia anyway. And researchers of the Habsburg Empire even today tend to pass over the investigation of similar facts. I don't want to overestimate the significance of such phenomenon, but I think if we'd like to have a wider perspective, we have to control the story behind this membership. So according to the above, I had reason to suppose that if it was right, and Austria-Hungary was indeed a colonizing and colonial empire, then the evidence for this statement might also be proven by investigating the history of the Hungarian sub-empire. By benefiting from the methodology of the Vienna School of Discourse Analysis, I scrutinized the debates in the Hungarian House of Representatives in which the terms colony and colonization were used. And this ambition of me was inspired by Ulrich Hofmeister. He published the book, The Burden of the White Tsar. This book refers to the colonial and imperial attitudes of the Russian Empire towards Russian Central Asia, so Turkestan. It's a well-written book. So it exceeded all my expectations that in the relevant debates, first, it was possible to identify the evolution of the political concept of the term colony. Secondly, I found evidence that Hungarian political public life considered Bosnia-Herzegovina as an Austro-Hungarian colony between 1878 and 1918. And finally, I found answers to the questions how the Hungarian political and economic elite approached the issues of empire building and colonization. Between 1878 and 1914, the term colony or colonization was used in a total of 522 interpellations or speeches in the Hungarian House of Representatives. It should be noted that members of the parliament use the Hungarian words gyarmat and gyarmatosítás and not the Indo-European version of colony and colonization. The vast majority, more than 2/3 of the interpellations, were held by politicians of the opposition parties, basically members of the Party of Independence, also known as Kossuth Party, which criticized the system of dualism, fiercely criticized. The various meanings of the word colony fall into 8 categories. In the right column, Hungary is the colony of Austria. I have no enough space, so as the former colony of Austria. So I have to make it closer. So it should be noted that in the debates about colonialism, the dividing lines were not necessarily drawn between the governing parties and the opposition. Between the Austro-Hungarian Compromise, 1867, and the occupation of Bosnia-Herzegovina, 1878, the main rupture was to be found between the representatives of the government party and the former officers of the Honvéd army who strengthened the opposition and who, after losing the War of Independence in 1849, had basically lived as emigrants in colonial empires like in Great Britain and France. On the other hand, between the occupation and the Millennium celebrations in 1896, the members of the House of Representatives discussed the question of colonization on a generational basis. More than a third of the relevant debates took place in the 12 years between the turn of the century and the annexation of Bosnia-Herzegovina, when the two opposing camps were distinguished by the fact who had transatlantic experience and who did not. So who visited Great Britain, Canada, United States, Mexico, or West Africa. After 1908, it is no longer possible to show a significant dividing line. If we analyze the relevant interpellations based on these categories, then of course these are subjective categories of me. Then the first group is definitely made up of those that prove to be practically useless from the point of view of our investigation. Such categories were when the term colony was used as a synonym for settlement, site, establishment, or diaspora, or when referring to the African and Asian colonies of other colonial powers. Perhaps when the speakers argued that the Benue monarchy had no colonies. So in total, 37.5% of the examined interpellations can be classified into these categories. But why do I say that these interpellations are useless from the point of view of our research? The reason is simple. Based on the above statements, it is not possible to determine what exactly the members of the Hungarian House of Representatives understood by the term colony. It only seems that the representatives viewed the word basically through the bipolar dichotomy of colonizer and colonized, and saw no legal, political, or economic difference between the British, French, Italian, Spanish, German, Dutch, or Danish colonies or overseas dependencies. The term of colony was a kind of collective concept within which no different categories emerged. The above debate did not distinguish between the British Crown Colony and the French Overseas Department, or between countries under direct or indirect rule protectorate. It is also essential to highlight that the members of the Hungarian House of Representatives had superficial impressions and information about the overseas and continental colonies owned by European states rather than real knowledge or expertise. The situation is quite different when we analyze the interpellations in which the Kingdom of Hungary was referred to as a colony of Austria, more than 50%, in which occupied Bosnia-Herzegovina was considered an Austro-Hungarian colony, or in which Austria-Hungary appears as an empire that aspired to acquire colonies at global level. In these debates, the evolution of the Hungarian concept of colony and its semantic field can be very well investigated. The interpretation of the term colony used in the House of Representatives at the turn of the century, regardless of whether it referred to the word as a political, economic, philosophical, or cultural concept, was rooted in the self-image of the Hungarians, or better said, in a real or assumed historical situation. It was based on the assumption that the Kingdom of Hungary was in a colonial position within the Habsburg Empire prior to 1867. The political memory of this assumed or real political situation was shared by both the governing and the opposition parties. The coherent interpretation of the term colony became abstract in the speeches of one of the leaders of the national opposition, Ferenc Kossuth, who was the son of Lajos Kossuth, between 1898 and 1901. This period is very important because during these years, the Joint Minister for Foreign Affairs, Agenor Golokowski, made an open attempt to develop Austria-Hungary into a great power with overseas colonies. In Africa, this was the Rio de Oro project, and in Tianjin in China. Rio de Oro is today this Western Sahara or Sierra Leone, south from Morocco. So it was a real attempt, but we do not know the details. Some elements of Kossuth's interpretation had already existed before, but they came together like that for the first time in his speeches. According to Kossuth, a colony is an agrarian country producing agricultural and raw products that is economically dominated and controlled by a more industrialized state. Economic control is exercised by the more industrialized state as the sole proprietor of the customs and trade policy, which also enables it to create a safe market for its own manufactured goods in the colonized agrarian country. So this interpretation of Kossuth remained basically unchanged in the debates in the Hungarian parliament until 1918. On the one hand, this definition described the relationship between Austria-Hungary and Bosnia-Herzegovina, and on the other hand, it can also be interpreted well for the theorists dealing with the colonialism of our time. Scrutinizing the speeches in which the interpellators reflected on Austria-Hungary as an empire capable of launching global colonial actions, and in which the term colony is used in connection with Bosnia-Herzegovina, it can be clearly proven that between 1878 and 1918, the Hungarian political public, and let us not forget about the political and economic press as well, regarded Bosnia-Herzegovina as an Austro-Hungarian colony. The contributors, whether opposition or government representatives, did not clash their views on whether the occupied provinces were colonies, but rather whether the Austro-Hungarian monarchy, compared to various British, French, German, and Russian analogies, was a good colonizer, and whether it was pursuing an appropriate colonial policy. Moreover, they reflected on the extent and manner too in which the Kingdom of Hungary should participate in the tasks of the joint empire to be carried out in Bosnia, which goals the Hungarian political elite should follow in their effort to participate in the governance of Bosnia-Herzegovina. The vast majority of relevant debates took place in the Hungarian parliament, as said, between 1898 and 1903, in the years when the joint foreign minister, Agenor Golubovsky, attempted to persuade the political decision makers and economic interest groups of the Hungarian sub-empire to support the colonization efforts of the joint foreign ministry in Africa and in the Far East. One of the unexpected consequences of Golubovsky's ambitions was that a major political campaign was launched in the Budapest parliament against the despotic governing practices of Benjamin Kálai, who was the joint minister for financial affairs and the governor of Bosnia-Herzegovina. The opposition parties of the House of Representatives formally attacked the person of the governor, but the relevant debate was actually about the direction in which the joint empire should develop in the future and how the civilizing mission of the Hungarian nation should fit into the foreign political aspirations. The features and consequences of this debate in Hungary strongly resemble the impeachment trial of Warren Hastings in Great Britain. But do not misunderstand it. There is no possibility in Austria-Hungary to launch an impeachment trial against a joint minister. So it's not possible, technically. All in all, the elimination of Kálai's despotic policy, in other words, the way to transform the bad empire into a good empire, was for the opposition in Hungary the promulgation of a constitution, a new rule of law in Bosnia-Herzegovina. For the Hungarian opposition, the memory of the bad empire was connected to the absolutist Habsburg Empire prior to 1867, while the good empire was nothing else but the dualist monarchy formed by constitutional Austria and the constitutional Hungary. As Hungary civilized Austria by forcing it to establish a constitution in 1867, the main goal of the Hungarian civilizing mission in Bosnia-Herzegovina was to give the occupied provinces their own constitution. For the Hungarian opposition, constitutionality and the rule of law were the conditions for participating in the colonial governance of Bosnia and Herzegovina. It erred, one demanded the legal accountability of the joint finance minister's activities as governor of Bosnia and Herzegovina and the adoption of a Bosnian constitution. Coming to the third point of my lecture, it is important to state that based on the parliamentary debates on colonialism, the claim of international, mainly Austrian historiography by Evelyn Korn, Simon Lloyd, for example, that the political and economic elites of the Hungarian sub-empire impeded or hindered the colonization efforts of the joint Ministry of Foreign Affairs can be clearly refuted. The social elite groups of the Hungarian sub-empire were, under three conditions, ready to support the imperialist and colonial policy of the joint empire. First, the target area of this policy should not be Africa or Asia, but the Balkan Peninsula, possibly Anatolia or the Middle East, so the former Levante, East Levante. Secondly, the foundation, and this was the most important reason, the foundations of the dualist system should not have to be renegotiated because of this policy. It erred, colonization should not become another joint issue and should not receive a fourth joint ministry. And thirdly, never use the term colonialism to refer to these ambitions. So we finance these ambitions, but no way colonization, because both parliaments, so both the parliament of the Austrian sub-empire and then the Hungarian sub-empire, we refuse to finance such ambitions. Finally, the national opposition of the House of Representatives reconciled with the above aspirations and views and became its active supporter even after 1908, so after the annexation of Bosnia-Herzegovina. The reason is simple. They were able to connect imperialist and colonial politics with the national traditions of Hungarian liberalism. In the possibility of extending the Hungarian constitutional principles to Bosnia-Herzegovina, so Bosnia received its Landsverfassung in 1910, so 2 years after the annexation. So the extending of Hungarian constitutional principles to Bosnia-Herzegovina, they no longer saw a rights-depriving expansion in line with the Habsburg absolutist traditions, but a rights-enhancing integration in line with the Hungarian liberal traditions. They believed they would modernize and civilize the inhabitants of Bosnia-Herzegovina through colonization, and thus, in addition to expanding the European legal order, they would also fulfill their civilizing duties towards humanity. Humanity in meaning that, so the Kulturnationen of Europa, so the cultural nation, because they have right to colonize abroad. I'm ready. This was my very last time. So I hope, Raul mentioned yesterday that it is a challenge how to influence the public, the society with this kind of new histories. It is a question. So the book is published, and that's waiting for the result.
So the last speaker will be Gábor EGRY, director of this institute, being responsible for organizing present conference. Please, Gábor.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for these wonderful presentations. It makes my task easier, but also harder, although I decided in advance to be probably the least formal with my presentation and the most subjective as well, building a bit on the experiences from the project. That was, at least in its title, Post-Imperial, about post-imperial transitions at the local level. So I'm happy that I'm not the first one to invoke empire and imperial history in this room, and not just today, because I'm the last speaker of the panel, but it was really intensely discussed yesterday as well. What is it exactly? I want to give a full description. What's really important, I think, for the sake of this discussion is that it's first not just a simple methodological issue. It's how to look at certain historical events, how to approach it, what kind of sources to use, and how to interpret them, but also very clearly a historiographic agenda as well, with the aim of integrating into continental or even global history those empires of the European continent that were classically, because of the lack of overseas colonies, somehow seen outside of the category of the empire based on the idea of the modern colonial empire. And in this sense, I think we can also say that it is an attempt of emancipating the area in East Central Europe to a certain extent from the label of being less functional, some kind of lesser part of the continent, not entirely fitting ideal types that are developed on certain historical interpretations of the West. Nevertheless, despite this kind of emancipatory aim of new imperial history, its relationship with national histories is explicitly or implicitly that of a challenge. And we can discuss it, I think, further. We will discuss it inevitably further. The consequence that Raoul mentioned yesterday, that it could lead to a rehabilitation of empires as much better than they were portrayed, not exactly being the prison of nations, even fostering nation building instead of hindering it, is rather the result of the specific context of the respective empires. And here I just would like to draw attention to this kind of oppositions of nationalizing empires and quasi-empire nation states. So when we talk about the Russian Empire, new imperial history, one of what new imperial history brought regarding the Russian Empire is the idea of the nationalizing empire, in the sense of speaking of an imperial level and imperial project of Russian nation building. That's very different from what the new history of the Habsburg Empire claims about at least the western part of Austria-Hungary. But it's also critical of successor nation states of these empires, explicitly pointing out certain important analogies or even continuities. That's also a question of the NEPOSTRANS project as well. However, and this is in a sense very important, when we are trying to pin down these categories and attach to certain historical states, that what's quite clear, not just from new imperial history, that somehow the state is a changing entity. And in a sense, it is impossible to pin down what is exactly imperial in a state formation with ongoing centralization and an ongoing boundary work between state and society. So somehow rethinking the boundaries of the state, what is within the jurisdiction of the state, how it is exercised, what kind of actors are exercising certain state functions. And that makes it, on the one hand, easier to draw these analogies. On the other hand, probably it makes more problematic the clear-cut conceptualizations. Nevertheless, and this is very important for all of the analogies and also for the project, the most important, and it was also, we heard it also yesterday, characteristic of an empire within the conceptual field of new imperial history is the rule by difference, and the idea that the empire is about the management of difference. It is a key imperial characteristic. However, the first very important issue is how much it is institutionalized within an empire and how much it is informal. It's also important that the empires very often use interlocutors and try to cope local elites, and this makes the rule by difference or differentiated rule even more complicated. And also, again, we heard about it, although in a different context. Biographies are also important in the context of a global history. Biographies are also very important, and not just because it's easy to somehow map through the physical mobility of figures the imperial space, or at least the physical quality of the imperial space, but also because, and this is where history of science is very much connected with imperial history, it is assumed that these imperial figures, who are key actors in managing imperial diversity, also draw upon some kind of common expertise and knowledge about how to manage the empire. So why the NEPOSTRANS is in this, in a sense, post-imperial, and what does it bring, or what does it bring to our work? The starting point were these characteristics of empires, because they are not necessarily associated with the empire as a specific state form. What we were looking for is rather, and this is why it's in a certain sense, a post-imperial project, to grasp some kind of retrospective gaze to the empire, looking at through the continuities and the ruptures, what actually was characteristic of the empires before their collapse, or the Austro-Hungarian Empire before their collapse, but survived the catastrophe and became significant in one way or another, intentionally or unintentionally, for the successor states. However, the scale of this analysis is local. One of the reasons is that with the disappearance of this overarching state structure, it's relatively easy to argue that the local becomes, for a short moment, much more salient in the lives of societies or in the organization of societies. And the new nation states does not necessarily face a kind of assemblage of the ruins of empire, but rather local societies that are actively engaging with this new state building project they are facing now. And that's what brings, I think, the most important benefit, that it makes, in a certain sense, state-society relations from before 1918 better visible, because of the integration of efforts of the new states very often take into account the existence of these continuities, not necessarily formally, and this is a different matter. So we can also talk about how much an empire is formal or informal, not in the sense imperial history uses the informal empire in a sense of economic influence, presence, but in the sociological sense of informality in terms of practices. Yes. So if we, and just to give an example of this informality, how important it could be, I hope that I still certainly have some time to do it, and again, apologies to everyone who have already heard this story from me, because I use it quite frequently, is the very distant Hungarian county of Máramaros in the northeast of dualist Hungary, which was inhabited by mostly Greek Catholic, Ruthenian and Romanian-speaking population, and a large, but not insignificant, group of Hungarian speakers, and also mostly Orthodox Jews, but they had not much role in running the country. Nevertheless, the country was ruled by an overproportional number of noble kings. So around the turn of the century, it was estimated that 20–25% of the population had some kind of noble title before the abolition of the serfdom already. And they were linked to each other with strong kinship ties as well. So they run the country as a kind of informal feudal domain, always in association and alliance, political alliance with the Budapest governments, but they were never really bothered by the governments what they were doing locally. There were even customs that the Lord Lieutenant, who was the head of the county administration, should always come from some Máramaros family. And as it was an interethnic group of noblemen, at least the Romanian speakers could actually continue to serve the state after 1918. But what is more important, that they did it practically the same way as they did before 1918. They concluded political alliance with the dominant Romanian party in Bucharest that had no real electoral base in Transylvania. They could, in exchange, run the county as a feudal domain. Many observers actually explicitly criticized the situation in Maramuresh as a kind of oligarchic feudal rule of Hungarians, because the Romanians still had the Hungarian noble titles, and they were proud of it that they had Hungarian noble titles from before 1918. And it lasted for 2 decades. So, and when the Hungarian administration returned, actually they also looked for someone who was part of this noble kin networks and installed him as the prefect of the county. So there is a kind of practice of differentiated rule there within actually a homogenizing nation state part of the empire that is simply transferred to Romania and used the very same way. Nevertheless, it's more important, I think, that what kind of more abstract conclusions we can draw from these cases that could inform our understanding of empires, but also probably nation states as well. So, and this is also the limitation of the project, that it's more focusing on the practices of statehood, because one of the assumptions is that in many cases in the nation states, these kind of practices are hidden behind a facade of legal homogeneity through uniformization as well. Although for a long time, laws are also retained. It's always dependent on kind of boundary work, what the anthropology of the state calls boundary work. What is within the state and its jurisdiction? It's always about some kind of shifting boundaries. It's never really a stable situation. We can observe not just the practices to continue, but also certain figures transferring their knowledge from the previous era to the new rules, and also the modes of rules. But that also means a kind of selective continuity of the institution. So it's not, if there is institutional continuity, that's not necessarily complete, selective, and it's also always exposed to kind of political considerations. What is retained and not necessarily to benefit the locals. It could even result in the disenfranchisement of the locals. One of the examples is, I think, very good examples if there's this practice is actually how certain states like Poland, also Hungary, retained local electoral and local administration systems that were highly undemocratic well into the late 20s, just because it was much more advantageous for the new national elites not to face local electoral battles with local minority majorities, so to say. And also, it's very often highly informal. That makes it harder to grasp, and also probably much more malleable than an informal way. But nevertheless, and this is also a very important aspect, it gives certainly a sense of how an empire looks like from below, how much people are attached, not necessarily to the empire, but what they actually experience from the empire through these practices. And that's obviously part of the persistence of imperial structures. Nevertheless, and this is also very important, it's very easy to call this kind of management of differences imperial, but once it was actually Balin to ask me a question when I wrote something about how dualist Hungary was probably more imperial than it is used to think. If we apply these categories, we can find several examples of how differentiated rule is present even within this formally unitary state. But that's so somehow, because of the informality, it's not necessarily imperial. And even though in this case one can claim that, well, in the Hungarian case it had roots in a composite statehood before the format, whatever, it doesn't necessarily apply to all states in this sense, that they have some kind of feudal roots, privileges that are somehow transitioning to this new uniform statehood. But I think that if we step upwards on the ladder of abstraction, then maybe we can think of the state slightly differently. So the conclusion is not necessarily that empires somehow very much differ from nation states, but rather nation states are also struggling with managing difference, even if they do not necessarily admit that they are struggling with it. And at this level of abstraction, that's an inherent part of all statehood, somehow to deal with difference. And from this perspective, although empire and nation state seems to collapse into each other, we can probably still find a differentiating characteristics, but making it much clearer how these continuities could operate and why they are not so surprising. And finally, but I won't deal too much with it, Jan SURMAN already gave a very detailed talk of it. There is really the elephant in the room, the colonial and the post-colonial. It's coming to the field, and it's not just Galicia that it's built there. And I subscribe to most of your criticism exerted to it. It's illuminating very often to use this kind of toolkit to reinterpret, but it's very easy to miss certain very specific context. On the one hand, I think the origins of diversity in these states is much more rooted in the feudal past that is very hard to conceptualize as a kind of modern colonial. And even when it comes to tropes that resemble subaltern, it's very often about actually finding somehow a new balance within a group and not differentiating. So, for example, the search for national authenticity in case of peripheral subgroups of the nation, like with the Seklers, the Mots in the case of the Romanians, and claiming that they are the most authentic part of the nation, is not necessarily about an institutionalized difference between the colonized and the colonialist. It's rather a rethinking of the same group with a new balance, symbolic power balance within it. And we can also, I think, when we will also certainly continue this discussion on post-colonial. So, thank you very much.
Thank you for you. And before allowing the flow, the free flow of the discussion and even the debate from the floor, may I take the role of the discussant? I was requested to do this by Gábor yesterday. I would like to emphasize that it looked to me that 4 basic issue was presented to be on the agenda as a result of the papers given here. The first one is, they are questions. What could have been the relationship between empire and colonization? They are very close. Are they very close or not? Is it a necessary fact that any empire, modern empire, of course, not antique or medieval ones, should colonize a peripheral, a marginal, non-European or marginal European areas? So, is it a very close relationship which connects empire and colonization or not? And to what extent may be it a very close relationship? In what's the second issue, the second question, which may be formed, which may be sounded is, in what sense and to what extent may be the term, the notion, post-colonial can be or may be adopted to such a specific European setting like Habsburg monarchy or Austro-Hungarian monarchy, Central Europe in a wide sense. In what sense and to what extent? This was an issue which rose in your paper to some extent, but the answer which may be given to this very, very fundamental problem and question needs more detailed discussion. I would promise that this will be on your side. When I was participated in one of the first conferences dedicated to Habsburg post-colonial, the result was the first book you showed. This conference was contrived and organized by Professor Maurice Chaki in Vienna several years ago. This initiation looked very surprising, that whether the notion post-colonial, which comes from the subaltern studies, adapted to the history, the past of India, living in colonial status, may be adopted, may be used at all, reasonable way to such a very specific state formation and social societal entity like Habsburg monarchy. This had happened in the 2000s, as I remember. It was very, and I think that the question is still very, very actual and waits for answering. Whether, to what extent and in what sense may be post-colonial term, which is not as European, authentically European historical development, can be used in connection with the Central Europe. The third issue, which may be mentioned here, to be discussed or worth discussing, is the role of the concept history in all of these studies. As I heard, I listened to Krisztián's paper. My answer to the question may be that yes, concept history is an indispensable toolkit for approaching the problem. He investigated statistically the parliamentary discussions revolved around the term gyarmat, colony, in the late 19th century in the Hungarian parliament, a typically concept history approach, which appeared here in his lecture. And I think that this may be brought further in terms of the scholarly use or usage of the term post-colonialism. I refer now to the former question, to what extent and in what sense may be adapted or adopted or taken over the subaltern post-colonial notion by us. The fourth issue may be that what can be or what could be the precise relationship between the notion and practice of the so-called internal colonization, what you used in your paper, and the nationalization of some part of society of modern nation states, with the aim of making ethnically homogeneous the population of particular areas like Máramaros and other peripheral areas of modern nation states. What is the relationship between the two phenomena or the two developments identified by these terms, internal colonization and or nationalization? Formerly, we applied the term nationalization to these occurrences, not the internal colonization. It is a new development in the concept history area. And it is not very clear that are they the same or very close to each other, or what is the difference between them, etc., etc. I think that okay, and the fifth, may I increase the number of the questions? What does it mean, empire? Gábor's paper focused on, differing from the two former papers, the new imperial history theory or approach, not the post-colonial one. May I ask, maybe argue that the Austro-Hungarian monarchy, for example, the state formation existing following the compromise settlement of 1867 was an empire. Is it true? And in what sense was it an empire? May it be compared to the British Empire or the Russian Empire, etc.? When Germany was united around the same time, it became a nation state, so to say. But the self-definition of a German Reich was that it is an empire. Yes. What does it mean? In that case, the notion, the term empire in the German case, and what does it, which cannot be the same, which was not the same formation, state formation, or viewing it from an ethnical viewpoint, was not the same like the Austro-Hungarian monarchy at the same time. And both the two entities, historical entities, was designated, was called to be empire. So there are several confusing issues around the term using empire in this case. Okay, now I would like to give you the word, I would like to, we would like to hear your opinion about all these questions inherent in the papers and my discussant reports. So, please.
May I reflect to the first question, empire and colonization, because I haven't.
In the meantime, look at Erika Szívós's questions on the screen. Speak, Krisztián. Just
okay, now, okay.
Yeah.
So,
please, Erika.
The question of empire and colonization, I think the link is between the Kulturnationen, cultural nation, and colonization, because only the cultural nation has the right to govern other people, other nations. There is a kind of hierarchy, and it was clear for me from a Czechish topic. In Paris in 1919 and 20, there was a Czech campaign. A campaign was launched in order to have the German one part of the German colonies to the Czechoslovakian state. It was a campaign in Paris, and the real meaning was, of course, not that Czechoslovakia wanted to be a colonizing power, but it was a question for the great power politicians after the First World that prior to 1918 there was no independent Czech country. Is the nation in Czech ready to govern itself? It is also a question of, or maybe I can foster a debate with Bence, who wrote his thesis on this self-governance in Eastern Europe. So it was the question that the representative of the Czechish nations wanted to give evidence for the open public in Europe that it is a cultural nation and it has the right and the ability to govern itself. And the colonization was a tool so the ambition to have these German colonies was the way. And anyway, the colonization was not just the project of the empires. The small nation states, Sweden, I don't know, Denmark, and such, wanted also have a colony in China, but it was rejected by the great powers. So the ambitions was there to have an own colony or participating or benefiting somehow of the European colonization processes abroad. So, thank you.
Thank you. Please.
My name is Ben Spurry, and thank you. So my name is Ben Sebari, and first of all, I would like to contribute to the last question Mr. GYÁNI asked, like how to talk about empire as a concept and as a structure. And I think like this is a serious point to it, because first of all, we can also talk about what kind of concepts are there for empire in various national languages. Like you, for instance, mentioned Reich, as that would be a parallel in German for empire, but like many times it is not, right? Like Reich is not a literal translation of empire or vice versa, but it also means realm. So Österreich is not Eastern Empire, but rather the Eastern March or Eastern realm, and the Deutsches Reich is not necessarily German Empire, but also realm. So we have to investigate in how does the term empire operate in various national languages, what kind of connotations does it have, what kind of discourses does it utilize, and what kind of reasons. So it's a very complex topic, and I'm all for discussing it. But on the other hand, I would like to have a question to Krisztián CSAPLÁR-DEGOVICS, because I think you argued successfully for the fact that while there are projects of colonization, and especially discussions of colonization in Austro-Hungary, and they have a specific terminology at the same time, I think this is very convincing. But on the other hand, I also know that you dealt with the projects of nationalism in Albania and in Bosnia-Herzegovina, which are really like closely related to Austro-Hungary and its foreign policy. But for that reason, I would like to ask, what kind of relationship do you see between the Austro-Hungarian projects of colonization and discussions of colonization and local projects of nation building? And before I let you answer the question, I think this is an important issue because in the British Empire, in metropolitan France, like the project and discussion of colonialism also has a strong relationship to the concepts of race and nation, right? Like race is utilized by the colonizing empires to categorize native societies, to establish a difference, strong difference between European and non-European populations, whereas nation appears in local discourses in the colonies as a concept adopted from the Western powers or the Western societies as such. And I would like to ask whether do you see a similar kind of relationship dynamic between Austro-Hungary and its perceived colonies as such, or within the Austro-Hungary as such?
Yes, please. The microphone at the back.
Yes, so thank you very much. I was really looking forward to this panel, and I liked all your presentations. Actually, I would have the same question to all three of you. So as you saw yesterday, I come from economic history. Economic history is a very massively run by the United States and the United Kingdom. So economic history is, as a result, euphemistically put, quite relaxed about imperialism and colonialism. So I've really learned a lot of new things here. And what I want to know from you is the following. So the post-colonial history, is that fully critical of colonialism or only partly critical? So that's a kind of where I would really like to sound out where the three of you stand. So my understanding from what you told me is that it's largely critical, but I would like to know sort of how far that goes in your work, or also in these key works which some of you referred to. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Holly Case. I'm sorry I missed the beginning of the panel, so if something was said that addresses this, my apologies in advance. My question is about the earlier period, the turn of the 18th to the 19th century, when you see in the region that we study a lot of anti-imperial activity, but that's sponsored by empires. And I was wondering about anti-imperialism and whether we have to take into account that empires are often anti-imperial in their express presentation, like Russia is now. It was anti-imperial in its express representation during the Soviet Union, and it continues to express itself in those terms. And what are we to do with a rhetoric that doesn't stick to a particular normative regional universe, but that moves and has been moving for 200 years plus, maybe?
I have lots of questions and remarks, but perhaps in our panel I will continue that. I just have one empirical question to Krisztián about the constitution of Bosnia and Herzegovina, because I don't know that, but as far as I remember, so finally it was not the Hungarian constitution which was kind of applied, but there was a new design, right? And if I understand correctly, that the act of annexation, legally speaking, was not a separate act from giving the constitution. So in fact, giving the constitution was the legal act of annexation. Is it correct? Thank you.
Thank you. Just a quick question. So obviously this has been a huge debate, and thank you for the interesting panel. But it seems to me that when we kind of make a taxonomy of practices in the Habsburg monarchy, which we could characterize as imperial or somehow colonial, wouldn't many of those practices overlap with those of the successor states? If you think about, especially, I mean, most of the successor states trying to homogenize, trying to just rule by difference or govern, manage the difference. Many, settlements were made in all kinds of ways, all kinds of ethnic engineering, and so on and so forth. If you think about economic layer of that. So I would say that aren't some of these things just characteristics for the, states of this period, whether or not they name themselves as empires or anti-imperial or as wholly now? I mentioned this tension also between self-fashioning and actual, how we would analytically approach them, and nation states trying to narrate their radical, difference and political kind of advancement. So I don't know if that makes sense, but how big is the overlap, would you say?
It will be short. When I studied the occupation of Bosnia, it turned out that all four major commanders that commanded the Austrian troops were Filipović, Rodić, Jovanović. So the Austrians who occupied it were actually commanded by South Slavic commanders. And what I'm referring to about this kind and what you meant, Begriffsgeschichte, can we somehow, are imperial actors actually so easily to be designed to one of these camps? And I also like what Gábor said is about what did in the debates, half of the discussions on colony was Hungarian being the colonized. So how can we somehow, what is the way out of all of this?
Already forgot half of them. Thank you so much for all the questions. Actually, like on one of the first slides that was shown about the context, the concepts, you saw actually Agenor Gołuchowski, who is a Galician nobleman, then Minister of Exterior. His brother is at the same time the Minister for Galicia. So there is also, an overlap with practices of one Gołuchowski on a global scale, with the second Gołuchowski on a local scale in Galicia of a Polish nobleman against, for example, Ukrainian peasants. So there is like a lot of these complexities, and one of the issues of postcolonial histories is to untangle this kind of complexities, and to go back from the last question to the first. There is a very big, there is also a question what colonialism is and what is the colonialism in the postcolonial theory. And I think there's a lot of plural in them. So I can give a working definition of what I understand as colonialism in postcolonial theory. And it's a rather cultural one than economic one. And then how I understand it and how I think it's usable, the overlap between nation building, empire building is fairly large. It's, in the way of practices of cultural violence, of practices of cultural othering, there are quite minimal differences actually. So this is exactly why, I think that we can use the postcolonial approach also to understand national building process. We actually have to do it because, we want to understand the dynamic, we want to understand the kind of processes, the different identities, the question of communication, and so on and so on. So this is my big plea. Is postcolonial critical to colonialism or not? The answer is it's less critical to colonialism than the colonial theory is. Does it make you happy? No, probably not. The answer would be, I think that what joins postcolonial and parts of the colonial is the acceptance that we cannot go to pre-postcolonial, to pre-colonial, sorry, to pre-colonial. So there is no way to kind of try to find pure ethnicities, pure approaches, pure categories, which are untainted by colonial influences. If this is an acceptance of colonialism, then it is a part of it. It's not, but it's an acceptance of colonial past, rather or acceptance of post-colonial present, which we cannot really change. We can discuss it, we can be critical towards it, but we cannot escape it. Although some scholars representing the colonial theory would try to find some kind of pre-colonial past and try to build identities basing on it. Whatever, whether it makes sense or not, it's another question. But there is a movement in it. But postcolonial is rather accepting it and trying to live with it, and that kind of connects to the question, which is about how what is the interest of former colonial powers in using postcolonial theories. And this is exactly this. Looking at own stereotypes and own culture and trying to disentangle it, look at the colonial past, the processes which shaped it. And this is both in the case of the small field of postcolonial studies in Russia and with the bigger field of postcolonial studies which is coming from Vienna. This is why it's also very connected with the memory studies. This is kind of deconstructing own memory and own stereotypes with the use of postcolonial approaches. But also it is very important to say that also Poles were colonizers. I don't know, if you want to, Poles were colonizing in Galicia, like very openly. And especially if you take a cultural concept of colonization, then also probably Slovaks and Ukrainians were colonizing, for example, the Jewish population. Or after the, in the post-imperial time, in the process of nation building, they were in a way culturally colonizing the minorities, trying to shape them into a monolinguistic nation. So there is no very easy division between colonized and colonizers. And one of the interesting points about the Polish, the first wave of Polish discussion of post-colonialism is that the introduction of term of colonized colonizers to the Poles, and the question of how the different stereotypes kind of translate we are colonized by the Germans, but we are at the same time colonizing Ukrainians. So what kind of cultural dynamics is happening in there? And I think that's everything I remember. In case I didn't answer anything, then over the coffee, I would be very happy to clarify things.
Thank you.
Bence. So the local nation building projects and its link to Austro-Hungarian colonialism. As far as I know, prior to 1914, I was not able to find any sources, but a student of me who is Anastas Beja, he's from Albania, and he's doing exactly this. And during the occupation time and in the territories of the occupied territories of Austria-Hungary, they found evidences from the field of literature or sources written by officials and officers with totally different social origin and a Czech, an Austrian, a Polish. So, and this racial hierarchy, which reflects to this nation building, is clearly there. So I'm now also waiting for the results of this thesis, but as I say, prior to 1914, nothing. But during the First World War, we can, I hope we can draw analogies with these British examples you mentioned. So colonized or colonizers is partly an answer to Erika, to Hannes, and maybe to Adam as well. So from the Hungarian point of view, between the annexation and the First Balkan Wars, a narrative was constructed on this Hungarian aspirations towards Bosnia. And it was a kind of back projection to the last 3-4 years, and it touched upon such topics as constitutionality as well. So the line was the follow. Filipovic and the Austrian legal experts took part practically in these projects. But from the Hungarian point of view, who was the one who was able to get Bosnia-Herzegovina to Austria-Hungary? It was Andrássy, Gyula Andrássy, the foreign minister, joint foreign minister. Who was the one who civilized Bosnia-Herzegovina? It was the Hungarian Benjamin Kállai. And who was the one who gave constitution, Landesverfassung, for the Bosnian people, the Hungarian István Burian, and the details were not so important. And through this free person, the Hungarian media, the members of the parliament, representatives of economic and political groups wanted to or intend to give an evidence that the Hungarian nation is able to organize an empire, is able to govern a colony. So, it's another question to this. Hannes touched upon this topic, that colonized and co-colonizer. So I think there is the difference between the Austrian and the Hungarian sub-empire. As for Hungary, from the 19th century, I know only the Japan example, as they were able to pace from this potential colonized position to the colonizers, obviously. But it was a challenge for the Hungarian liberalism, because it was a leading tendency that we were the subaltern, the oppressed, and I don't know. But at the turn of the century, it was clearly also for the opposition that Bosnia-Herzegovina is a fact. Austria-Hungary was given the mandate to govern Bosnia-Herzegovina, and it means that also the Hungarian sub-empire had to take part in this process. And at least the opposition thought, okay, if the colonization is good for the nation, if we benefit or profit from this process, why not? But this opinion emerged only on the eve of the Balkan Wars, so in the very last moment. And as for the present day, from the point of view of the historiography, in 1947, Austria, a legal deal or law was, or a declaration was accepted by the government that Austria has no colonial past, and it had its impact to the colonial research in Austria. This law was integrated not because of the Austro-Hungarian past, but because of the Third Reich, or the German Empire. But in the last year, in 2022, a new declaration was published by the Austrian Cultural Ministry. And I think this is the new period for the Austrian colonial research. I quote it: "Although Austria is not regarded historically as a colonial power, current research has revealed the multiple involvement of the Habsburg monarchy in colonial affairs." So, and according to Walter Sauer, this is the very beginning of the potential Austrian research and colonialism. And Erika asked that whether this co-colonizer aspect has influenced the present-day Hungarian policy. Yes and no. In his political practice behind the scenes, yes, there is an imperial ambitions of the Hungarian foreign ministry, but it's not seen. It is somehow behind the scenes on the territory of the Balkans. But for the public, of course, this colonized, this self-victimization position is more of importance.
So, thank you very much. I won't answer all of these questions. I'll speak a few that I think is important. I would start with Holly's. Not that I have a real answer, but first we can even add to these paradoxical things, anti-imperial, imperial biographies, so revolutionaries who were socialized within imperial context and whose lives quite neatly fit to the category of imperial biographies as mobile figures drawing on knowledge that they gained within the imperial context and using it against the empires. So what I think could be one important issue is whether it's a kind of systemic antagonism towards the empire that drives the attempts of other empires to undermine their rivals, or a kind of logic of the rivalry, and what kind of political imagination of an order is behind it. So do they really want the nation states that they want to create with weakening their rivals to become equals at the international level, or treat them still somehow differently? And here, the Balkans is a really fascinating area, as Krisztián knows it much better than me, how these Balkan states at one point just slip out of control with the Balkan wars of the international great powers. And that's probably a harbinger of a new era in the international order as well. To Lucia, I think it's what I try to argue, that if you go on a higher up level of abstraction, states are always struggling with differences. How they manage is important. And here I think it's in these concrete cases, what's important, how much it is informal and formal in the successor states, and how they came to the state's repertoire, in a sense. But it's really for the specific case of the successor state in the transition. So is it deliberately applied from above, and who is coming up with the idea in the national government? Or is it, in a sense, thought out by the local society that they should be treated still differently, like something similar happened with the Maramuresh case, so from below, and so on. And it's also, I think, to a certain extent connects with the one question of Gábor's that I would pick up, and the internet colonization, because I think it's a crucial issue regarding the post-colonial colonial studies. So it's one of the frequent arguments regarding the colonial nature of these nation states, empires, whatever, that they are practicing internal colonization on a mass scale that Jan already mentioned. And I think that there is still some kind of threshold. So it's definitely not the same in 1890 to colonize parcels in Transylvania than it was in 100 years before in the Banat. So it's some different. Probably the one thing that's quite clear, and this is also to a certain extent pertaining to Erika's question, that it's still happening not only from the side of state actors that you mentioned, the Poles, Transylvanian Saxons are colonizing. So again, at one point, the Transylvanian Saxons start to imagine that their internal colonization will be part of a larger German ethnic breach from Germany to the Middle East, to Anatolia along the Baghdad-Ban. And that's probably a much more imperial idea of colonization than, but it's still somehow adapting to what's going on. But there is, I think, a threshold, and this is not exactly the internal colonization, but more about the assimilation, non-assimilation. So what's the moment when this is not anymore about assimilating people, but accepting that they are unassimilable for several reasons, mostly for biological or semi-biological reasons. We know that the concept of faj in Hungarian is just partly biological as well. So it's really, I think, an important element. And what is the empire? I think we used one. But what could be important, I think, because everything that I try to list as the characteristic definition of an empire is obviously easy to transpose to difference. That's how much the actors imagine that what they are doing is happening in a foreign space. And in the case of the Austro-Hungarian economic imperialism in the late 19th, early 20th century, that's quite clear that what they know that in a sense where they are acting is a foreign space, so it's not part of the empire yet or whatever. So maybe that could be important in this regard. And just a quick remark regarding the co-colonizer and all these issues. I think that what fascinates me with these economic imperialist designs of Austro-Hungarian government and capitalists is that they actually come up with an idea that's, I think, much funnier than the co-colonizer, what I would call quotenmäßiges Imperium. That they should share all the businesses according to the dualist quota of the budget. That's always the basic idea, how Austrians and Hungarians should distribute the benefits, even if they are private persons. So,
yes.
So I actually have one other question which I didn't answer, and I will answer it very, very briefly. It was, what do we do with anti-imperial imperialism and the question of, for example, Russia using this anti-imperial rhetoric? And two things. The first one is I mentioned Alexander Etkind and his question of internal imperial, his book on an investigation of Russian imperialism. And there was a little bit injustice of putting him on the same screen as Eva Thompson. He's much more critical. He's much more refined in deconstructing the Russian imperial rhetorics. And what I think our task is also as historians is to make a dictionary of conceptual history of Russian political speech, because Putin and his entourage is using terms which are, for example, very often encountered in early Stalinism discourse on nationalities. For example, nationalists, how they are defined, or imperialism, how it's defined. But then they are sometimes somehow very differently understood, because like the context, how they understand it, the context, how it's understood nowadays is very different. And I think that we need to make it visible to show this kind of continuities, and in order to understand what kind of various levels this Putin speech and this expansionist speech actually has, and just simply in order for politicians, for example, to understand what the interlocutors are saying. So we need, for example, the conceptual history of Russian use of the term imperialism, nationalism, and so on and so on. And I think that's something that historians can do in order to be a little bit more significant. Thank you.
Thank you. May I have a last remark as a response to your question, whether post-colonial theory is critical or not to the colonization. I think that the post-colonial history writing, not theory, but history writing, as it is represented by, especially by the subaltern cultivators of the subaltern studies, is critical mostly of the national paradigm which gives a framework, a conceptual framework for European, modern European history writing. It is, on a meta history level, very dominant characteristics of that kind of thinking, called post-colonial one. That the nation-centered history writing is not something that could be used or applied adequately to the once colonies, past colonies. Okay, thank you for all of our panelists and for all those who contributed from floor to the discussion. And now I close the session. Thank you.